In this crazy mixed-up world, you need fake news you can depend on. When news is breaking, it's probably the fakest.
It's probably the fakest that's breaking it. That's me. I'm Paul Defoe.
We've got a commercial, Paul.
Breaking the fake news for real. From KCOM Studios in somewhere west of New York City, this is The Fakist.
Only one podcast is on it. On the scene, making it up, breaking the fake news for real. With more reporters covering more fake stories. Coming June 18th to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, Google Podcast, and VoiceFacts. I can also email you the transcript if you want. Check us out at thefakist.com and subscribe in Apple Podcast for a new thrilling episode every 2 weeks. Pretty timely. The Fakist. We fake it when we make it.
Hello. It's supposed to have me on screen here. I'm not sure if I am on screen or not. If anyone is in the chat, please feel free to let me know. Oh, I know what I did. I bet I know what I did. There we go. Hi, guys. This is Bill Meeks here. Let me get full screen, maybe. Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry. It's been like a year since I did a live stream, and I was getting through and setting all this up today, and it was challenging, but we're here. We're live. Get used to it. Okay. So if you're not familiar with the Fakist podcast, I'll probably give you just a little bit of an idea of what the project was. So back in 2015, I don't know if you remember or not, but there was this presidential candidate who kept complaining about fake news. Yeah, that guy. And I was working in news at the time at Hearst Television out of the Wesh building in Orlando, Florida. I worked for the corporate side of things, but it just kind of shocked me because every single journalist I knew personally, I was super dedicated to objectivity and, all of these hoity-toity, highty-flighty ideals that we want journalists to exhibit in their work, right? And so I was like, well, wouldn't it be weird if there was a news team as devoted to making shit up, and there will be cursing in this, sorry, as real journalists are to making the real news and doing it ethically and responsibly and stuff. So I started The Fakist. It's a podcast, sort of like an audio dramedy, but the format of it was always a newscast where you're just listening to a newscast and they're making shit up. They're making up 3 fake stories every episode. And then in between the stories, and it becomes more and more as the show goes on, you get into the lives of the fake journalist actually reporting the news. I think of it as a comedy. I think it honors journalists. It doesn't tear them down. It honors them. And it's always been a very, very personal project for me. So I did the podcast, right? I did the podcast for 3, 4, 17,000 years, whatever it was. So I did the podcast, and we wrapped it up with The Fakist one last day in 2021. I was like, okay, this is it. I'm never doing anything with The Fakist ever again. I'm moving to Los Angeles. I'm going to try and do stuff out there, and The Fakist is in the past. And that seemed like a pretty safe bet considering, the guy who had come up with the idea of fake news to begin with, he was out of office, right? And Biden was in there and things were looking up. So I was like, you know what? The world doesn't need The Fakist anymore. So I don't know if you noticed over the past couple of years here, but well, really the past 6 months or so, but the person who came up with that idea of fake news was back in office. So I was like, and since I wrote The Fakist, because it was kind of run and gun while I had a whole full-time job and everything. So I always felt like I wasn't able to put as much of myself into it as I wanted to. And I felt like I really figured out the story in the last season, and which is why there's a lot of flashbacks in the last season to earlier in the story for me to shore things up. So, I've been sitting on those episodes, those scripts that I wrote for a couple of years, and back in October, I was like, okay, uh, you know, whether Trump gets into office or Trump doesn't get into office, I think there's going to be an opportunity here to kind of finally tell this story from beginning to end exactly as I developed it over the course of a few years making the podcast. So I started writing the first book in a 4-book series, The Fakist Breaking News, which kind of comprises, I would say, elements of the Christmas special, Leanne's episode from the last season, which is a lot of flashback, and then most of the first season, up to and including the big finale. If you know the show, you know what I'm talking about. So that's kind of been it. So I basically tried to. I'm trying to think of. It has been a while since I've live streamed, so I'm not quite great at extemporaneous as I used to be, which is why we'll get into reading the book in just a minute. But it was really interesting to dive back into the world of the Fakist and sort of re-explore these characters and figure out why the characters that were important to the story were so important to the story, right? It's been a joy, honestly, tapping back into the Fakist and sitting down and writing Fakist material. I told my wife Anne Marie, who plays Ella Fitzpatrick on the show, I told her that it felt like I just wrote the last episode of One Last Day yesterday, like that Fakist voice that I've always had in the writing for the show came right back to me, and it felt like going home again. So I do hope you enjoy the Fakist. Before I get started here, let's see here. I loaded up a couple of clips from the old show just to give myself some breathing room. So why don't I go ahead and yeah, actually these are good. I'll go ahead and play one of these Leanne clips, which is one of her flashbacks, and probably material we'll end up covering today. So listen to this and then I'll be right back.
After college, I went to work for my hometown station, WAFM TV3 in Birmingham, Alabama. My first day on the job, I met Jerry Springer. Just walked around the corner and there he was, getting hit by a stripper with a chair. Ow! I loved it. I was good at producing too. I even won a regional Emmy for my work covering the anti-puppy protests. Then a Throwback Thursday post from my college's Insta account went viral. I'm Leanne Snyder and I'm a tire fucker. I'm Leanne Snyder and I'm a tire fucker. Tire fuck? Did you say tire fuck? Mr. Jim, the big boss, called me up to his office.
Miss Snyder, how dare you besmirch the great name of WAFM TV3? We're Birmingham's beacon, for goodness sake.
And that was a little clip from The Fakist, One Last Day. Here, let me go ahead and get my screen up here so you can read the screen along with me. Let's see here. Okay, I want to share my screen. I want to share a window. I want to share this window, which has the book. And there's the book. Here, I can probably zoom that in a little bit for you and me as well. Okay, so, and then I have that, and I have my little, well, you can't see it, but my audition window, excuse me, up here. I'm probably going to end up coughing a lot. I apologize in advance. All right, so let's go. Here, I'll go ahead and hit record. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and record this last line from the last section too, just so I have another copy of it. So, okay. Hold on, I have this like, normally my audition window that I'm recording this in is over here on my main monitor, but the script's up there right now, so I can be kind of at least pretending like I'm looking at the camera while I'm reading. So give me 1 second here. All right. There we go. And we're recording. I'll have to edit that out later. Paul wanted to create. Actually, I apologize to live stream viewers. I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller so it's easier for me to read. Okay. It was during one particularly heated dinner, after Monty had spent the better part of an hour explaining the intricacies of hedge fund management to a deeply uninterested Paul, that things finally came to a head. I don't want to work in finance, Paul said bluntly, stabbing at his steak with his diamond fork. Monty froze mid-bite. His diamond fork hanging from his mouth as though someone had just pressed pause on a very condescending documentary. I'm going to take that again. All right. Monty froze mid-bite. His diamond fork hanging from his mouth as though someone had just pressed pause on a very condescending documentary extolling the virtues of rich assholes. What did you say, boy? Monty asked, his voice dangerously calm. I don't want to work in finance, Paul repeated. Once more, with feeling. I'm going to work in TV. There it was. The truth out in the open. There it was. The truth out in the open. It hung in the air like a mime at a radio convention. Present, but out of place. For a moment, Monty said nothing. He simply stared at Paul with his dark, sunken eyes, as though trying to process what he had just heard. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his cracked, wrinkled face. A smile that had absolutely no soul in it whatsoever, like AI art. Television, eh? Monty repeated, the word dripping with disdain. I can make that drip with disdain a little bit more. Television, eh? Monty repeated, the words dripping with disdain. You want to be a television personality? Like that failure John Tesh? No, Paul corrected. I want to create news. No, Paul corrected. I want to create news. Stories? I want to tell stories in a whole new way, like nobody's ever done before. I'm going to try that again. Take a little sip here. Ew, no, Paul corrected. Excuse me. I want to create news stories. Well, I want to tell the news in a whole new way, like nobody's ever done before. On the news, you know? It's clearer in my head. I hesitate to throw in those you knows in there, but you know, it's my writing, so it's okay. Monty's smile faltered, replaced by a look of incredulity. Okay. Monty's smile faltered, replaced by a look of incredulity. Stories, he echoed, leaning back in his elephant skin chair. You're still dreaming in fairy tales. The news isn't about storytelling. It's about placating and provoking the proletariat, little rascals. The news isn't about storytelling. It's about placating and provoking the proletariat, little rascals. There's no place for fiction in the news, only narratives. Paul grinned, leaning forward. Fake it till you make it, right? Unsurprisingly, Monty didn't take Paul's decision well. In fact, he didn't take it at all. You're throwing your life away, he declared the following morning, after the initial shock had worn off. I'm giving you one last chance to do right by me. Enroll in the Wall Street Institute of Banking and Financial Shenanigans. Follow the plan, or kiss your inheritance goodbye. There are other young people I can take under my wing. I don't need you. Paul packed up his things and left that afternoon. Monty stood at the doors of Defoe Manor, watching him leave with a mix of dashed hopes and boiling rage. Excuse me. Speaking of boiling, something in my throat there. Monty stood at the doors of Defoe Manor, watching him leave with a mix of dashed hopes and boiling rage. As though Paul had announced plans to join a traveling circus as one of those cursed magicians in some sick soup. That's a sentence there. The magician thing, my dad was a magician, so my biological father, so that's a little reference there. As though Paul had announced plans to join a traveling circus as one of those cursed magicians in some sick soup of privileged betrayal. In some sick soup of privileged betrayal. That's hard to say. In some sick soup of privileged betrayal. There we go. That's something. All right, next section. Let me get a sip. I see one person out there watching. If you want to say hey, feel free. Paul's new life started at the Bill Harper School of Journalism and Classic Car Auction House, even by the most generous of standards, an unimpressive institution. Most people who saw the name assumed it was either a leftover relic of the 1970s or a front for some underground car smuggling operation. Neither of these things were true, but the name had an undeniable charm. And more importantly, it was exactly the kind of shady place Monty would hate. Paul stepped onto campus that first day feeling a sense of liberation, as though he'd finally cut the last apron string tying him to Monty's toxic apron. The campus itself was small, a patchwork of low-slung buildings with peeling paint and a subtle scent of stale cigarettes. The journalism department shared a studio space with the auction house, which led to some rather surreal moments where students would prep live news broadcasts while vintage K cars were being... Oh, I just lost my headphone. Let me pop that back in here. I didn't like how that sentence was coming along anyway. Let's try it again. Let me get a sip too. The journalism department shared a studio space with the auction house, which led to some rather surreal moments where students would prep live news broadcasts while vintage K cars were being wheeled past them on the way to the auction block. Paul loved it. Sure, it wasn't exactly the prestigious Wall Street Institute of Banking and Financial Shenanigans. The professors were an odd mix of former journalists, current auctioneers, and, in one case, a man who claimed to have worked as a car salesman in 3 different counties, but who never specified what those counties were. The curriculum was equally... This is a very hard sentence to say. Thanks, Bill, who wrote this for me to say. The curriculum was equally eclectic, covering everything from broadcast ethics to the finer points of bidding strategy based on the Blue Book values. But for Paul, it was heaven. The rules were loose, and the boundaries between fact and fiction were mostly suggestions to keep in mind in the future. And the boundaries between fact and fiction were mostly suggestions to keep in mind in the future. Paul wouldn't need them. Paul thrived in this environment. While other students were learning how to write concise, fact-check news articles, Paul was busy... Excuse me. Let me get another sip here. While other students were learning how to write concise, fact-check news articles, Paul was busy creating elaborate fake... I think I need a can of water. Give me 1 second. I do see some other people hopping on there in my viewer count. I'm not sure how accurate that is. But hello to the stream. This is a loosey-goosey. I'm recording the Fakist audiobook. It's slow going because my voice just decided to give out on me, probably because I haven't live streamed in a while and I'm nervous, but it's all right. We'll do okay here. And we'll just take it from Paul thrived in this environment, I think. Oh, let me get a sip. Paul thrived in this environment. Paul thrived in this environment. While other students were learning how to write concise, fact-check news articles, Paul was busy creating elaborate fake news stories. Paul was busy creating elaborate fake news stories. Paul was busy creating elaborate fake news stories, complete with current pop culture references, friends playing eyewitnesses, and wild, silly premises. His professors were baffled by his approach and would have failed him if his professors were baffled by his approach and would have failed him if his tuition check hadn't cleared. His classmates, however, were intrigued. He became something of a legend on campus. The guy who didn't just report the news, he faked it. One of Paul's most infamous projects was an investigative piece titled Bigfoot. One of Paul's most infamous projects was an investigative piece titled Bigfoot Joins Twitter, the legend in 140 characters or less. Bigfoot joins Twitter. The legend in 100 Bigfoot joins Twitter. The legend in 140 characters or less. There we go. That was it. Paul managed to convince half the campus that the legendary Sasquatch had joined Twitter to send cryptic messages to his true believers. The story was so elaborate, so ridiculous, that it earned him an A. Mostly, his professor admitted, for sheer audacity. And yes, Paul's checks kept clearing, which always helps. And here's a picture of Paul and Ella for people who are familiar with the podcast. And here's Paul and Birdman Stan. Oh, and we're on to chapter 2. Perfect. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to save that out. And then save as. And then this will be O2. And meet the team. I'm setting up a new project. You can't see it because I'm only showing the window with the script on it. Give me 1 sec. All right, perfect. And let me just make sure I didn't erase my original project. I did not. Perfect. I see it in there, Sean Barr. What if you read it like you were the Batman announcer? That's a good question. Hey, man. Yeah, because if you weren't on the inside of the Fakist back in the day, I had a character called Batman Announcer who would show up from time to time. So let's see here. All right. So chapter 2, meet the team. That's my project 2. I have saved out the other projects so I won't lose everything I've just done. Hit delete. There we go. All right, we'll save that. And then we'll hit record for chapter 2, meet the team. Sean Barr, who's in the chat room, you might really enjoy this. I can't remember if any of your characters show up in this one, but it is a good roundup of the news team. Chapter 2, Meet the Team. The Bill Harper School of Journalism and Classic Car Auction House was not known for producing conventional journalists. To be fair, it wasn't really known for producing anything, except perhaps a solid appreciation for classic cars, a vague understanding of broadcast ethics, and a fucking silly amount of profit for Mr. Bill Harper. And a fucking silly amount of profit for Mr. Bill Harper. That's hard to say. And a fucking silly amount of profit for Mr. Bill Harper. I'm glad that sometimes it's nice when you have troubles like that, because you end up stumbling into a good read. Frustration is motivation, right? Okay. The journalism program was a one-of-a-kind creation, held together with duct tape and a prayer. And yet, among the peeling painted walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and rumored scarlet fever contamination, Paul Defoe found something unexpected: his people. Paul's first encounter with his soon-to-be news team happened in what the school referred to as a newsroom, but was in fact a repurposed auto repair bay. The room reeked faintly of motor oil and lingering failure. The desks were arranged in haphazard clusters. And the AV equipment was, well, vintage would be giving it too much credit. Johnny Carson would have found it dated. And the AV equipment was, well, vintage would be giving it too much credit. Johnny Carson would have found it dated. Paul was sitting at his desk, flipping through a binder full of outdated production notes, when the door swung open with a dramatic bang. I am probably going to be putting music and sound effects in this, guys. Just for fun, just so you know. Hold on, let me take another sip here. A tall, wild-eyed man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a general air of disheveled chaos soaked in black okay. A tall, wild-eyed man. A tall, wild-eyed man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a general air of disheveled chaos soaked in black velvet strolled in, whistling to himself. Here, I'll do a whistle. That will probably actually make it into the book. He was wearing a pilot's uniform. Man, my voice is already tearing me up. It's weird because if I wasn't live streaming this, my voice would be fine and I would be able to keep going. But because I'm live streaming, I get nervous. My voice gets scratchy. All right. He was wearing a pilot's uniform, though it looked like it could have been pulled from a bargain bin at Spirit Halloween the first week of November. His hair stuck out in all directions, and there was something about his general demeanor that screamed, "Don't trust me with heavy machinery," which, as it turned out, was precisely what Paul would end up trusting him with. "The name's Birdman Stan," he introduced himself, as if Paul should have already known who he was. "Helicopter pilot extraordinaire. You buy it, I'll crash it. Paul cocked his head, confuzzled. "You crash helicopters?" Stan grinned, showing off teeth that looked like they'd survived one too many crash landings. "Only the ones that can't handle me, which is most of them." The next student to join their motley clique was Byron Seals. Byron was, to put it lightly, an enthusiast. Not about traditional news, mind. Not about traditional news, mind. Not about traditional news, mind. Byron's true passion was mythology. All gods, any gods, big gods, demigods. If it had its roots in ancient Greece, Byron loved it. He'd been known to bring elaborate dioramas exploring Zeus's dating life into the classroom/newsroom, much to the horror of the HR department. And once gave an entire presentation on the man in the sun. And once gave an entire presentation on the man in the sun that turns winter into spring. The man in the sun that turns winter into spring. Sean Barr in the chat room. That was what distracted me. Says, I hear Bobby in your voice. Yeah, Bobby Hawk voiced Birdman Stan, Janitor Jim, a couple other characters. I'm doing my best to respect and represent Bobby in my reading. All right, next page. Byron's specialty, when he wasn't ranting about Zeus's sex life, was news production, particularly news graphics. He even built the class new packages of lower thirds and animated bumpers for their show, fitting in mythological symbolism wherever he could. He also had a knack for finding news stories that were, at best, paranoid fantasies. He claimed it was all part of the gods and their grander vision. Though most of his fellow students suspected Byron's interest in mythological weather, could power an entire newsroom on enthusiasm alone. Tim Monet was the most nervous person Paul had ever met. Always fidgeting, always glancing over his shoulder as though he expected some kind of disaster to strike at any minute. Always glancing over his shoulder as though he expected some kind of disaster to strike at any moment. And yet, despite his constant state of anxiety, Tim had a remarkable talent for insight. He could see the angles other journalism students missed and pick apart a story like he was unpacking a Kinder Egg. Tim's only problem was that he didn't believe in his own abilities. Every success was met with an immediate, not that good, right? I mean, I could have done better. Really, it's fine. I'll fix it. Even when there was nothing to fix. Here, I'm going to do that one more time. Every success was met with an immediate, not that good, right? I mean, I could have done better. Really, it's fine. I'll fix it. Even when there was nothing to fix. Paul had a soft spot for Tim, a kindred spirit who recognized the flaws in tradition, but hadn't yet broke free. Not in an incel way, for the record, more in a founding fathers way. Actually, I should probably read that more romantically, huh? Okay. Paul had a soft spot for Tim, a kindred spirit who'd recognized the flaws in tradition, but hadn't yet broken free. Now, not in an incel way, for the record, more in a founding fathers way. Paul had no doubt that under the right conditions, Tim could make up groundbreaking stories if only he'd stop second guessing himself long enough to let it happen. All right, let me get a sip here before we get into Grace. Grace Huber Stafford, pronounced how it's spelled, was a lowly technical director in training. Squirrel-like, was a kind and common description of her general vibe. Grace had a tendency to wander into the newsroom in the middle of a broadcast on local public access station that's a mouthful. Grace had a tendency to walk into the newsroom and Grace had a excuse me. Grace had a tendency to wander into the newsroom in the middle of a newscast broadcast on local public access station SWONC TV. That's somewhere west of New York City. Announcing she'd found a new lead on an investigation, then disappear for hours on end without further explanation, leaving a trail of glitter in her wake. Nobody was ever quite sure where she went, but she always returned with some new piece of information that usually turned out to be useful, or at least interesting enough for the C block. Paul once asked Grace about the glitter and the $1 bills that would fall out of her stockings. Paul once asked Grace about the glitter and the $1 bills that would fall out of her stockings during class. But Grace just laughed and said, "Even investigative reporters deserve some secrets, Paul," with a sly wink. Let's see if I can do a better Grace voice. "Even investigative reporters deserve some secrets, Paul," with a sly wink. Grace wanted to be an investigative reporter, and she made no secret of that fact. Grace often scribbled notes about wild conspiracies straight out of the Fox News playbook, determined to crack them wide open. Some of her most impressive stories... Oh, thought I saw something flash. Okay, cool. Some of her most impressive stories included "The Fish Are Gay, and That's Okay," "Is It Okay the Fish Are Gay?" and finally, "Good people are saying the fish are actually bisexual, so even gay people get to judge them." Grace had no problem crafting a problematic narrative. And Paul knew she'd be essential to what he was building. Enter Barry the Naturist. Hard to miss him, but I thought it was important to point him out before I get into describing him. I'm going to try that all from the top and take a sip first. It's a section break. I'm allowed. Enter Barry the Naturist. Hard to miss him, but I thought it was important to point him out before I get into describing him. Barry Tesh was, in many ways, an enigma wrapped in an existential crisis wrapped in exactly zero clothing. He was, without question, the most passionate advocate for naturist rights Paul had ever met. In fact, he was the only passionate advocate for naturist rights Paul had ever met. In fact, he was the only passionate Paul had ever met. Barry believed, with every exposed chest hair, that humanity's insistence on clothing was emblematic of everything wrong with America. "Clothing is a barrier to human connection," he'd often say, nakedly. I'll do that one more time just to have a backup. "Clothing is a barrier to human connection," he'd often say, nakedly. He attended every class au naturel, much to the dismay of the faculty. They would have expelled him on day one if it weren't for the fact that Barry had a gift for human interest stories and the fact that his checks cleared. Barry could turn the most mundane event into a heartwarming? Creepy. Okay. Barry could turn the most mundane event into a heartwarming tale that tugged at your heartstrings. despite being, most of the time, mostly naked. Paul tried on several occasions to convince Barry that perhaps his particular brand of journalism would be better served with clothing. Barry had politely declined, insisting his nudity was an essential part of his creative process. People tended to be more honest with you when your barriers and clothing were both non-existent. People tended to be more honest with you when your barriers People tended to be more honest with you when your barriers and clothing were both non-existent. Paul didn't quite understand Barry's stories, but they certainly weren't boring. Then there was Ella Fitzpatrick. From the moment Paul laid eyes on her at orientation, he was smitten. Not that he'd admit it, of course. Paul liked to think of himself as above dating a working class reporter like Ella Fitzpatrick, but there was no denying she had something special. She was tough, no nonsense, and had the kind of sharp, investigative mind that cut through bullshit like a chainsaw through butter. She didn't waste time on pleasantries either. Ella spoke in direct, often brutally honest sentences, and had a way of making everyone around her feel less competent by comparison. Every weakness Paul perceived in himself, Ella listed as a strength. Paul, naturally, tried to play it cool around Ella. He wasn't sure if he was succeeding, but every time Ella brushed past him with a curt nod, his brain short-circuited just a little. She had transferred from another program at the Bill Harper School of Journalism and Classic Car Auction House, the more prestigious muffler repair program, but had quickly grown disillusioned with the rigid rules and expectations. She knew she was the type of girl who liked to get her hands dirty, just not literally, so she transferred to the freewheeling journalism department. Here, she could investigate what she wanted, how she wanted, without the constant pressure of filling tires and investigating check engine light codes. For those who might be watching and don't know, Ella is played by my wife, Anne-Marie, and so I'm going to have to try and do, an impression of her Ella voice here. I hope I do it okay. Hold on. She's like, Paul. Truth is subjective, Paul said once. Yeah, because that sounded pretty Paul. Truth is subjective, Ella said once during a fiery debate on journalistic ethics. And frankly, it's a little boring. I think our job as journalists is to make things interesting. That'll be pretty easy for somebody like you, Ella, Paul said, trying to play it cool by saying the least cool thing possible. While Ella didn't think he came off as cool either, her eyes lit up. There was something about when Ella was talking about making shit up that made Paul's heart skip a beat. There we go. Over the term, this ragtag Over the term, this ragtag group of misfits became Paul's clique. They were, as far as Paul was concerned, the only people who saw what fake news could be, if only you were brave enough to bend the fuck out of the basic rules of journalism. And bend the fuck out of them, they did. The clique, as the other students, some teachers, and one janitor, Jim, called them, became the talk of Bill Harper's. They'd produce news segments with captivating titles like Power Rangers, but for real, or Do Pigeons Know More Than They're Letting On? That Power Rangers story was actually an actual story from the Fakist, by the way. I drop a few of those in here. Stories that push the limits of journalistic ethics, often ignoring those limits in pursuit of the fake truth, as Paul called it. Bernie McFerney, their long-suffering faculty advisor, had once been a respected news anchor, or so the rumor went, before he'd been unceremoniously outed from his position and forced, like many media figures in their twilight years, to stop doing and start teaching. Bernie was constantly on the edge of a nervous breakdown due to Bernie was constantly on the edge of a nervous breakdown due to a bad case of PNSD, post-newscaster stress disorder. But despite his irrational fear of mortal danger, there was a part of him that loved the creativity these students brought to the newsroom. He saw their fake newscasts not as journalistic malpractice, but as a bold, if misguided, new approach to the craft. Secretly, he hoped his son Ernie McFerney would land a job with his class of misfits one day. Hell, he'd be happy to take a job with them himself, a fact he mentioned at the end of every class. The clique's true origin occurred This is fun. If you ever listened to the Christmas special from the Fakist, this is kind of the scene from that. The clique's true origin occurred during the annual Christmas party / holiday. You know what? Before I continue here, I do need, I drink a lot of water. There's things that come with that. What? Don't show this again. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to play a quick little clip here. Let me find something fun. Oh, this is relevant. I'll play this little clip from the Fakist, and then we'll be right back.
Elon Musk sucks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon sucks. He takes 2.9% of every transaction to fund his death ray and put cars in space. He's like Dr. Doom, but you can see his pregnant face. Elon Musk sucks. 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 Man, he stinks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon sucks. Elon sucks.
Subscribe to The Fakist on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app by going...
Okay, we can go ahead and get rid of that there. But yeah, that was more relevant today than it was when I wrote it back in 2016. Elon Musk sucks. There's a whole fun story that goes along with that kind of... I believe Michael Lucero played Elon Musk, and it kind of makes a lot of comparisons between him and Doctor Doom. I don't know why. Okay, here, we'll go ahead and get back to the thing. Oh, hold on, my earphone thing is all weird and twisted. All right, there we go. I think I got it. The Click's true origin story, not origin story, Bill. Origin. The Click's true origin occurred during the annual school Christmas party. I'm going to do that all over again because that sucked. The Click's true origin occurred during the annual Christmas. I'll get there. The Click's true origin occurred. The Click's true origin occurred during the annual. The Click's true origin occurred during the annual school Christmas party / holiday car auction, where fueled by an historic amount of eggnog and cookies, pre-diabetic Paul found himself revealing his big dream to his friends. Picture it, Paul said, gesturing dramatically with a sloshing. Picture it, Paul said, gesturing dramatically with a sloshing cup of eggnog and an almost empty fifth of rum. We buy our own news station and keep doing what we've been doing here at Bill Harper. A news station where the truth doesn't matter. No rules, no boundaries, just pure, unfiltered freedom to make shit up. I'm going to do that one more time just for safety, but I did like that. I'll do it a little drunky too. Picture it, Paul said, gesturing dramatically with a sloshing cup of eggnog and an almost empty fifth of rum. We buy our own news station. No, that's not it. We buy our own news station and keep doing what we've been doing here at Bill Harper. A news station where the truth doesn't matter. No rules, no boundaries, just pure unfiltered freedom to make shit up. Birdman Stan snorted a bump of cocaine out of his beard. Sounds like my kind of news, Polly. Sounds like my kind of news, Polly. Oh. Byron nodded enthusiastically. We could do a whole segment devoted to Centaur-related shitstorms. People need to know. I'll try that one more time because that was really not a Byron voice. Byron nodded enthusiastically. Well, we could do a whole segment devoted to. Man, I'm trying to figure out how to do a good Byron voice. Maybe I just take it deeper. Okay. Byron nodded enthusiastically. We could do a whole segment. No, that's not Byron. We could do a whole segment. There we go. Byron nodded enthusiastically. We could do a whole segment devoted to Centaur-related shitstorms. People need to know. I might end up redoing Byron's, we'll see. Ella raised an eyebrow, but there was a glint of amusement in her eyes and 4 shots of... Ella raised an eyebrow, but there was a glint of amusement in her eye and 4 shots of whiskey in her belly. And who exactly would fund this little venture? Monty, Paul said, the name falling out of his mouth before he could stop it. Your estranged father? Ella asked. Your estranged father? Ella asked. Maybe that's... Your estranged father? Ella asked. No way, Paul said with a hint of doubt. It was just a drunken musing. There's no way he'd go for it. There's no way he'd go for it. Unless, nah, That would never work. But maybe? Despite Paul's success at Bill Harper, there was always that nagging voice in the back of his mind. Monty's voice, mostly. It wasn't enough to simply run away from Monty's expectations. He needed to prove something, damn it. Not to Monty necessarily, but to himself. He needed to show himself that he could take his idiosyncratic vision, his twisted bullshit version of the news, and turn it into something real enough to win the hearts and minds of a jaded public. Something that would have Monty choking on his imported truffle-infused black rhino sandwich the next time he turned on the TV. But first, he needed to complete his 18-week program at Bill Harper. But first, he needed to complete his 18-week program at Bill Harper. Let me get a sip here. Been going an hour already. That's pretty good. Paul's time at Bill Harper flew by in a haze of late-night edits, increasingly ambitious fake news segments, and the occasional car auction. By the time graduation rolled around, he had built a reputation as the most unconventional, unpredictable, up-and-coming journalist in town. And so, after delivering a fresh $3,000 check to the basement office of Bill Harper's registrar, Paul stood on the steps of the school. Paul stood on the steps of the school with his diploma in hand and a sense of purpose in his heart. He was ready to reject Monty's world, ready to make a name for himself, ready to rewrite the way we look at news, one fake news story at a time. But first, he needed funding. Luckily, he had a plan. And there, that is chapter 2. 2 chapters. All right. Oh, scrolling away. The Taste Bud Tavern Heist. Fans of the original Fakist podcast will probably recognize some loose elements of the Taste Bud Tavern and how it relates to the Fakist overall, from how I portrayed McDonald's in the Fakist. So instead of doing a very, very thinly, like vellum level thickness veiled parody of McDonald's, I decided to. I was always kind of worried that one of these days someone's going to come after me legally or something if it gets big enough. I was like, why don't I just change the name of the place, but still have it perform kind of the same function, right? So that's what I did. So any references, anytime you're expecting McDonald's to show up, it's going to be Taste Bud Tavern. So here. Let me see if there's anything. Sean Barr in the chat room says, Fakist team assemble. Thank you very much, Sean Barr. And haha, I hear Bobby's voice. Yeah, I think I mentioned that before. Yeah, I very much tried to do a good impression of Bobby Hawk. All right, so let's see here. We've got this. Let me get back to the beginning of the timeline here. Are we recording? We are recording. I can see my voice on the little timeline there. Perfect. All right, let me get a sip of water here and then we'll go. Sean Barr in the chat room says, don't want the real Grimace to come knocking on your door someday, right? Yeah, exactly. If you didn't catch, I think it was mainly in season 2 of the Fakist. There's a whole thing with McDonald's, and Grimace is one of their agents, and it's a whole thing. I highly go to thefakist.com, season 2. You won't be disappointed. But it's going to be Taste Bud Tavern instead of McDonald's this time. All right. Actually, yeah, I'll go ahead and read I forget if I read the chapter or not, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Chapter 3, The Taste Bud Tavern Heist. In the high-stakes world of corporate crime, certain rules of engagement are non-negotiable. You don't try to outwit a billionaire. You don't stage a heist unless you're backed You don't stage a heist unless you're backed. You don't stage a heist unless you're backed by a team of top-of-their-class professionals. And most importantly, you don't get mixed up with the fast food industry unless you have a death wish or a really, really good lawyer. As you might expect, Paul Defoe was never much for rules. Paul had no particular talent for crime. Nor was he especially interested in fast food, aside from his semi-weekly drunken taco hut runs. What Paul had, however, was a problem. Specifically, a problem that could only be solved with an infusion of cash large enough to make his fake news dreams a reality. KCOM Studios, one of the many struggling local news stations, had just announced it was selling off its news division. Paul's dream was right there within his reach. The fake news was his for the making, and at a very reasonable price. But there was one small hitch. Paul didn't have the funding to buy it outright. Monty had long since cut him off from that sweet, sweet rich kid money. Which was why, one rainy Thursday afternoon, Paul found himself hunched over his dining room table, surrounded by crumpled notes, empty Madame Capral's takeout containers, and a plan so complex he barely even understood it. Okay, my Fakist fam, Paul said, addressing the ragtag group of misfit journalists surrounding him. Okay, my Fakist fam, Paul said, addressing the ragtag crew of misfit journalists surrounding him. We're pulling a heist. For real. Now, to say the word heist might conjure up images of grand schemes and elaborate subterfuge. To Paul's mind, this would be the kind of caper that made Ocean's 11 look like Ocean's 4. In reality, Paul's heist plan was far less sexy, but every bit as cinematic. Heist? What the hell are you thinking, Paul? Ella asked, arms crossed as she pushed away her half-eaten Moo Guy panini. Arms crossed as she pushed away her half-eaten Moo Guy panini from Madame Capral's. Call it a hostile corporate takeover of the news division at KCOM Studios, Paul said, a weary pride in his eyes. We'll get some weary pride in there. Call it a hostile corporate takeover of the news division at KCOM Studios, Paul said, a weary pride in his eyes. Not just so we all have a job, but most importantly to prove to my estranged dad, Monty Defoe, that I can make the news, not just so we can all have a job, but most importantly, to prove to my estranged dad, Monty Defoe, that I can make the fake news for real. That I'm a strong, independent man who doesn't need daddy's checkbook. But since I don't have the cash, we're going to have to convince him to pay for it. Now, what did I do for Tim Monet? By convince, Tim Monet chimed in. By convince, Tim Monet chimed in with an egg roll. Tim Monet chimed in with an egg roll hanging out of his mouth. I hope you mean we're going to ask him nicely. Of course not, Paul scoffed. Of course not, Paul scoffed. We're going to fake it. And we're going to fake it and scam him out of enough cold, hard, blood-soaked cash to pay for everything. Duh. We're going to fake it and scam him out of enough cold, hard, blood-soaked cash to pay for everything. Duh. Paul's brilliant plan was met with silence. Not the kind of awe-inspired silence you'd expect from a group that had just been told they were about to embark on a righteous heist. Not the kind of awe-inspired silence you'd expect to hear from a group that had just been told they were about to embark on a righteous heist, but rather the kind of silence that came from a group who thought the plan sounded deeply stupid and very likely illegal. Oh, come on. This'll be cake, Paul said. Oh, come on. This'll be cake, Paul said, between bites of red bean. Paul said between bites of red bean cake taco bites. Paul said between bites of red bean cake. Paul said between bites of red bean cake taco bites. My throat's getting rough, boy. Paul said between bites of red bean cake taco bites. Monty's the kind of prick who is concerned with two things: his money and ensuring people remember him for having it. If we can convince him that this is a shrewd business move, something profitable, something cruel and corrupt that makes his life better and poor people's lives worse, he'll fund it without a moment's hesitation. Now, what did I do for Byron's voice? I think I did a little deeper, right? I'm in, y'all. How do we scam this jerk? Byron asked as he absentmindedly made erotic art of Zeus on his plate with fried noodles. Byron asked as he absentmindedly made erotic art of Zeus on his plate with fried noodles. Ah, Paul said with an impish grin on his face. That's where Taste Bud Tavern comes in. Culinarily speaking, Taste Bud Tavern was a profoundly unremarkable fast food joint. They specialized in greasy burgers, heart-stopping oil-drenched fries made with extra carby potatoes they bred in a lab somewhere in Illinois, and milkshakes that regularly induce sugar comas in the young and the old. They were beloved by no one, tolerated by those with few options. Excuse me. By those with few options, and generally left to their own devices in the fast food power rankings. While their main product was mediocre, their marketing was best in class. You could see their commercials every night during the real evening news between reports about the obesity epidemic and the fight for fair wages. You could see their commercials every night during the real evening news between reports about the obesity epidemic and the fight for fair wages. and the fight for fair wages for the working class. And the fight for fair wages for the working class. Here's how it's going to work, Paul said, slapping down a large wrinkled piece of paper covered in diagrams, arrows, and a fresh splash of sweet and sour sauce from the dish beside it on the table. We're going to pitch Monty on a health-conscious fast food line. Something trendy, something marketable, something deceptively unhealthy. A product he thinks will make him look good. And I can use the Taste Bud Tavern's name to get a meeting. And what do they have to say about this? Ella asked. Taste Bud Tavern never needs to know, Paul said, slapping more papers onto the already crowded table. I've taken the liberty of forging financial documents and a certificate from the Cool Parents Council, a lobbying group I totally made up. So the big plan is, we lie? Birdman Stan asked as he picked crumbs from his beard. Paul shrugged with a sly grin. More like, we fake it. Cool. I'll probably leave that laugh in. All right, sip of water here. After prep, practice, and several strategies, the alliteration I use in this, I love it, but it's so hard to say sometimes. Okay. After prep, practice, and several strategy sessions at Madame Caprau's, the day of the pitch finally arrived. Monty had agreed to meet at one of his private offices in somewhere. Monty had agreed to meet at one of his private offices in downtown somewhere west of New York City, in a building as sterile and soul-crushing as you'd expect from a man whose idea of decor was stock photos of mountains with motivational phrases like, "Success, it's lonely at the top." I'll do that one more time for safety, but I did like that. In a building as sterile and soul-crushing as you'd expect from a man whose idea of decor was stock photos of mountains with motivational phrases like, "Success, it's lonely at the top." Paul, drowning in a suit that didn't quite fit, sipped an iced chai outside the coffee shop across the street. Ella stood next to him, puffing away on her Virginia Slim. "This is totally going to work," Paul muttered. "Oh, this is totally going to work. This is totally going to work," Paul muttered to himself. "Or it'll blow up in our faces," Ella commented matter-of-factly as she took another drag. There's the drag sound. Paul shot her a grin, though the nervous twitch in his eye betrayed his shaky confidence. Either way, I've had a lot of fun working with you, with the team, on the... Either way, I've had a lot of fun working with you, with the team, on the project, you know? "Yeah, Paul, me too," Ella said, with a flavor of amused sarcasm that appealed to Paul even more. with a flavor of amused sarcasm that appealed to Paul even more than his delicious chai tea, which is really saying something because those things are fucking delicious. You ready? She asked. Paul whipped a fake mustache from his pocket and slapped it above his lip. Probably, he said. Just let me finish this chai tea. Just let me finish this chai tea. Have you tried these things? They are fucking delicious. Let's see if I have any more drink here. I could use some more. Wet to my whistle. Wet to my whistle is what I said on the off camera. Actually, I think about we're probably going to cap this after this chapter. And you'll be able to check out the rest of the audiobook when it comes out, probably next week. But I will probably need a little vocal break. Thank you so much, Sean Barr. Says he's loving it. Can't wait to read the rest. Actually, I keep forgetting on StreamYard. I can show this. Have to get going, but it's been fun revisiting the world of the Fakist with Mr. Paul Defoe himself. I'm loving it. Can't wait to read the rest. Keep it up, you creative machine. Take care. Thanks so much, Sean. Great to have you in chat. Somebody in chat, anyway. Okay, so. All right, let me get a sip of water here, and then we'll finish up this chapter. And now you've got a good idea of Paul's first big part of the book. And yeah, I think cutting it off before we get to Leanne is good too. One, because that way I can kind of workshop my Leanne impression a little bit. And two, so that way, you go and buy the book at thefakist.com or at everlyheights.tv. All right, we'll start from the beginning of this section again. The pitch meeting itself was, in many ways, a masterpiece. Paul, posing as Chad Bostone, burst into the meeting room with the zeal of a 1990s infomercial. Host, lacking only the authenticity. From behind the safety of his face, from behind the safety of his fake mustache, he painted a picture of a new world, one where fast food wasn't just cheap and greasy, but healthy. Actually, I should probably do this more like I'm Paul doing the pitch, right? From behind the safety of his fake mustache, he painted a picture of a new world. One where fast food wasn't just cheap and greasy, but healthy. A world where burgers were made from organic cows. Fries were fried to perfection in air-purifying air fryers. And milkshakes were full of antioxidants. He wasn't sure what those were, but they sure sounded healthy. Monty sat at the head of the table, his steely glaze betraying no emotion as Chad rambled on about millennial-friendly branding and the future of the fast casual dining lifestyle. He showed off creative and believable slides of key demographics. Smiling and laughing next to slogans like food, folks, and fitness. Our focus groups are loving it, Paul said with a grin. By the time he unveiled the Cool Parents Council's glowing endorsement, complete with a forged certificate of coolness, he had almost convinced himself that Chad's fake presentation could work. Best of all, We'll cover the cost of R&D by paying our workers less, Paul finished, pounding his fist on the table for emphasis. Monty's eyes lit up like a dog let loose in an all-you-can-eat steak buffet. Monty's eyes lit up like a dog let loose at an all-you-can-eat steak buffet. He stared at Paul/Chad for a moment. His fingers steepled under his chin. So, this will hurt poor people the most? He asked. Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly, Paul replied. Oh ho, I'm in. That's a little British, huh? Oh ho, I'm in. Monty chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He snatched a quill from his ink pot and signed the documents laid out before him. He snatched a quill from his ink pot and signed the documents laid out before him to authorize the transfer of funds to an industry standard anonymous account in the Cayman Islands. Funds to an industry standard anonymous account in the Cayman Islands. Funds that, unbeknownst to Monty, would never see the inside of a Taste Bud Tavern. Later, at Paul's favorite karaoke bar, Hungry Like the Wolves, later that night, the burgeoning fake news team gathered to celebrate a successful heist. I did not think that was going to work, like at all, Paul said after downing a shot of black velvet whiskey. Birdman Stan raised his own glass in a toast. To the greatest scam ever pulled in the name of journalism. Fake journalism, Paul corrected. Byron nodded, raising his mug of mead. And to the goddess Ares, How did I do his voice again? I did it deeper, right? And to the goddess Ares, that guided us to victory. Paul shrugged. And here I thought it was a little old me. Ella raised an eyebrow. You're lucky it worked, Paul. It was a half-baked plan. Better than an undercooked one, Paul replied. It's official, Fakist fam. KCOM's news division is ours. And with it, the power to fake the kind of news we've been dreaming of. Here's to the future of the Fakist. It's looking pretty darn bright. It's looking pretty darn bright. As they all clinked glasses together, Paul couldn't help but feel a sense... let me get a drink, because that was a fun but taxing voice there at the end. Pardon. As they all clinked glasses together, Paul couldn't help but feel a little bit of nostalgia vu. Nostalgia for a moment he was still living. That's a little too Paul and not enough narrator. Let's try that again. As they all clinked glasses together, Paul couldn't help but feel a bit of nostalgia vu. Nostalgia for a moment he was still living. Excuse me. This was the night everything changed for them. They weren't just aspiring journalists anymore. They were the masters of their own reality. And soon, the world would bear witness to the rise of the fakest news team ever. I'm going to do that whole last bit one more time just for safety, kind of rise it up in passion here. And then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. As they all clinked glasses together, Paul couldn't help but feel a bit of nostalgia vu. Nostalgia for a moment he was still living. This was the night everything changed for them. They weren't just aspiring journalists anymore. They were the masters of their own reality. And soon, the world would bear witness to the rise of the fakest news team ever. The fakest news team ever. The fakest news team ever. There we go. Okay, very good. Very good. So we've got that chapter done. And like I mentioned, if you're just hopping in here, no one's watching. Perfect. I don't think anyone's watching anyway. You might be watching this on DVR after the fact, but here, let me go ahead and get rid of my screen here. Come back up full screen. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for what, an hour and a half while I'm recording chapters of the Fakist. I'm going to continue to be recording chapters of the Fakist. If you want to pick up the book, it is available for pre-order on every ebook site you can think of right now. Kobo, Amazon. You can get it through Hoopla, through your library if you want to. It should all be live there, and it should all be up there for pre-order. But if you want to get the book today, you just go to everlyheights.tv, which you see down in my lower third there, and then find books. Or I believe I also have it right up at the top of the page on everlyheights.tv, where you can click into the book and get it. And you will receive a copy of the final produced audiobook that I've been recording here today as soon as I have it done. As soon as I have it done, I'll send it to anyone who puts a pre-order in through there. I will say, if you're planning on ordering the book, you have a couple options here. Let me explain to you what they do for me and the project, if you care about that at all. If you pre-order it, or if you order it, straight up order it through everlyheights.tv, I get the majority of the funds, which is very helpful. So I can pay for promotions to help get this book into more people's hands. And you also get, a few bonuses with it too. Like I've included the season 1 Fakist script book, every script from the Fakist season 1, and you'll get a free copy of this audiobook. But if you want to pre-order it over on Amazon, and I understand that people are boycotting Amazon right now, which I agree with, that could be very helpful too, because I believe the release date is this Wednesday, 2 days from today, February 12th. Yeah, I think February 12th. And if we can get a lot of pre-orders going in there, then when the book launches, it'll launch up the charts, right? Because it just showed up and it has 20 or 30 or 40 pre-orders. This must be a great book. I'm Jeff Bezos. This must be a great book. I should put this on suggested. Jeff Bezos is paying attention. And if you want to pre-order the book over on Amazon.com, it'll help keep him paying attention, and maybe he can make up for all the evil he's done this year. Other than that, like I said, you can go to everlyheights.tv or thefakist.com and find links to everywhere the book's available. Order it on everlyheights.tv, and you will receive a free copy of this audiobook, either MP3s or on Audible, your choice, as soon as it releases. All right. Well, I want to thank you guys very much. I'm going to go ahead, and I loaded up so many Fakist clips here, so I'm just going to play through a few of them before I take off. But thank you guys so much, and we'll see you soon. And enjoy the Fakist breaking news.
I wanna be your dancer. I want to touch your beard. Love is all around me, and it's making me feel weird. In every elevator, it's in my place of work. Oh, love is all around me, but HR is a jerk. Love's all around.
Hello? Hello?
Oh my God, Anne Marie! I can't believe it worked. I dialed up Skype, and I was like, you know what? Maybe I should try Anne Marie. and it worked. I can't believe it.
I know. They left me alone for a few minutes, so I was able to escape and pick up the call.
Oh, good. So you're okay there in somewhere west of New York City. They're treating you okay. No one's hurt you. No one's killed you, and you haven't had to look at Barry Tesh naked, right?
No naked Barry Tesh, but do you see what the cat did to my bangs? They're very pretty. The cat just went meow, meow, and just did this.
Oh, Mr. Free 7-Up? Yeah, maybe he was bothered by the fact that you looked exactly like Ella, so he gave you a makeover or something.
But I kept talking to him like, here, little kitty, here, my little crinkle. And he loved that. But then there was just something about my hair, and he just went, wah.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't write that. I want you to know I didn't write that. No, I've been thinking about you so much since Halloween and you left.
Who just scratched the fuck out of my husband? You did, little kitty.
I like Superman and bare naked ladies. Mr. Free 7-Up, open the portal back to somewhere west of New York City. Hey, Meeks' wife with a different last name. Want to come with? The kitty will snuggle up at your feet while you're sleeping.
Ooh, Bill would never let me sleep with a cat in the bed.
I'm allergic. I could die. My heart.
But the kitty is so cute.
Paul Defoe, the portal is open.
No, Anne-Marie. What about me? What about the kids? What about the next season of Harley Quinn?
Oh, come here, little baby. Of course I'll come home with you. Don't you worry, we won't let that mean allergic man anywhere near the stinky old portal, will we, kid?
All right, Team Fakist, let's go.
Bye, dear.
I don't have to tell you guys that things are bad, but I think if we kick names and take ass tonight, we might just be able to save the show.
Turn on your TVs, honey, let's go. Let's watch the fake news team and that jerk Paul Defoe. They only have one day to save the show. Is the fake news worth saving? They'll fight really hard, but it'll still blow. For the fakest news show is a fading. For the fakest news show is a fading.
Now we arrive at the day in question, December 13th, 2021. One last day to save the show.
One Last Day, a standalone story set in the world of the Fakist. Starting March 3rd on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and, well, everywhere else. Like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives.
Marlena, what's happened to you? You've transformed into a giant cockroach.
Oh, it was Stefano, John. He used my frozen eggs to turn me into this monster. Oh, how could you ever love a cockroach?
Like this.
Oh, John, you're so kind and generous. What did I ever do to deserve you?
Marlena, these antennae. Oh, and the weird jaggedy things on your legs. It's got me going crazy.
Don't forget the thorax.
Oh, the thorax. Oh,
And my tiny little legs, John.
oh, they're quivering with delight. Ooh.
In this crazy mixed-up world, you need fake news you can depend on. When news is breaking, it's probably the fakest.
It's probably the Fakist that's breaking it. That's me. I'm Paul Defoe.
We've got a commercial, Paul.
Breaking the fake news for real. From KCOM Studios in somewhere west of New York City, this is The Fakist.
Only one podcast is on it. On the scene, making up, breaking the fake news for real. With more reporters, covering more fake stories. Coming June 18th to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Google Podcasts, and VoiceFacts. I can also email you the transcript if you want. Check us out at thefakist.com and subscribe on Apple Podcasts for a new thrilling episode every 2 weeks. Pretty timely. The Fakist. We fake it when we make it.
Elon Musk sucks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon Musk sucks. Elon sucks. He takes 2 or 9% of every transaction to fund his death ray and put cars in space. He's like Dr. Doom, but you can see at pregnant face. Elon Musk sucks. 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 Elon sucks. Elon sucks.
Subscribe to The Fakist on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app by going to thefakist.com. You'll get every episode when we release it. That's Fakist with an I. See you next time.